Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third entry of the virtual Gadflies blog post with me, Ron. Just up top here, please excuse any noise. I do have the windows of my apartment open because it is extremely hot and I do not have air conditioning. So if you hear sirens, ambulances, police, I'll do my best to cut it out of the finished product. But I live in a pretty noisy area, so no promises. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about something pretty interesting, again, inspired by a book. Well, inspired by a book and a movie. And that is alliances. And we're going to be looking at alliances and grand strategy through the scope of Lord of the Rings. Now, for those who are maybe in different countries, or for people in general, I mean, Lord of the Rings is such a well-known sort of piece of intellectual property. I mean, I got to imagine a lot of people even around the world outside of, the Western quote-unquote world know about it. And I can guarantee you, if you haven't read it, there's probably a copy of it in your language somewhere. There's at very least the movies, which is kind of rare. The movies are just as good and just as lauded as the book series. So Lord of the Rings is a seminal piece of literature, and unlike most books, as I said before, the movie adaptation is a groundbreaking seminal piece of cinema. And the reason I want to talk about this isn't to prove how big of a fan I am of the franchise or the books, though I could talk for just hours about the intricate histories, but rather to talk about just one of the many instances of international relations that can be found in the book. Alright, and as I said before, that instance is alliances, and why even hobbits should care about them. So, alliances and forming them is kind of the backdrop of the entire first book and most of the rest of the trilogy. So, the focus is, especially in the first book, is building an alliance between what are called the free peoples of Middle-earth. Now, these are the elves, dwarves, humans, and even a few hobbits. They are fighting an existential threat that is a rising power of a Dark Lord in the east, Sauron. Men, humans, make up the bulk of this alliance. And within that group of men, there is one large, though declining, what we'd call a superpower called Gondor. Gondor has been in decline, and as Mordor is rising, at the same time, they begin to challenge the status quo of Middle-earth. Now, there's a whole host of problems in this age-old alliance. See, before all this, an alliance between the men, elves, and dwarves was in place. It's what stopped Mordor from rising the first time, and what ended a great war. But in the period of history that the Lord of the Rings books encompass, we find that that alliance is weakening. The elves and dwarves are declining in population. Their population is aging, for lack of a better term, but what's really happening is the elves are sort of, since they're immortal, passing on to what's considered elf heaven, essentially, because their time in the land of Middle-earth is coming to an end. The dwarves are pretty isolationist and are focused on expanding their empire, which had gone through years of just decline, losing their cave homes to all manner of monsters and beasts. And another popular, or not popular, but another somewhat great power, though probably more like a secondary power, is another group of men called Rohan, and Rohan is currently under the sway of an evil wizard who is weakening the king and putting them in a more isolationist stance, keeping them from assisting or from fighting back against Sauron. And Gondor itself even is led by a leader, not the king. The king is in exile, essentially. The king is one of the main characters of the story, but Gondor's current leader, the steward, is too proud to ask for help for most of it. He's also too ignorant. He doesn't want to believe what's happening. The kingdom of Gondor is just showing a lot of pride. They don't want to ask for assistance from anyone else. So this is what you have, a grand alliance that had once banded together to defeat a great power that was threatening the status quo of Middle-earth, now in a weakened state for a variety of reasons, having to contend with a rising power that wants to change the status quo of Middle-earth. Now, eventually, the elves provide some support. Again, they don't provide much manpower, but what they do provide is assistance in other ways, such as organization and somehow the dwarves as well put up some people. And Rohan even comes around. Rohan, the king of Rohan, the horse lord, is freed from his magical spell, from under the magical spell, and in one of the most famous scenes, Gondor lights an ancient system of warning beacons on the tops of mountains. And while the king of Gondor, the heir to the throne in Gondor, is in Rohan, he rushes into the king of Rohan's office and proclaims, "The beacons are lit. Gondor has called for aid." To which the horse lord of Rohan responds, "And Rohan will answer." So this is the alliance system that is set up in the Lord of the Rings books. And it's one of the main focuses of a lot of the heroes is gathering these people and convincing them to fight. I mean, there are a number of battles that actually occur, but for the most part, one of the main focuses is just on getting this alliance to work, collecting people, having them work together to confront an existential threat to their way of life. And not to be too on the nose, but we're seeing something similar happen in the world of international relations today. All right, you have the traditional Western and NATO alliances trying to protect a status quo. Okay, they've faced an existential threat in the Soviet Union all throughout the Cold War. And now you could say that the West is in somewhat of a decline. And they're having to face a new threat. Or a new threat is emerging, though we're just at the beginning stages. A new threat is emerging in China, who wants to change the status quo. So again, besides the obvious Gondor is the United States, a super powerful hegemon in decline narrative, you've got other traditional allies in the West, or in the NATO alliance, and even in non-NATO members such as Japan that have but who are still allies, that just have aging populations and declining, rapid population decline in general. You have disagreements between allies. You have Turkey, a NATO member, fighting Greece, another NATO member. You have the United States, demanding that NATO members pay their quote-unquote fair share of the military expenses. You have pride in the fact that the United States wants to be in charge, but at the same time wants people to pay more. You just have a whole host of problems that get reflected pretty well in the Lord of the Rings books, but instead of being in a fictional series of books, you have them happening here in real time, because these are just the traditional cornerstone problems of alliances, of getting people to cooperate in a system where cooperation is based on whether or not the country wants to cooperate. There is no super king in charge of the entire world that'll force countries to hold their word, that'll help fix the problems of non-cooperation and alliances, that can settle these disagreements. Like, the US played that role for a while, but we've stepped back from that, and whether that's because we're declining in power or because we don't want to take up that mantle is, I guess, a subjective opinion. So besides these problems, these macro level alliance problems that are happening with these big states, the elves are a big state. The Rohan is a secondary power, at least. The dwarves are a big race of people. The men of Gondor are an empire, or they were an empire. They're the ancestors of an empire. I want to talk a little bit about hobbits. Now, hobbits are a small group of people. They're shorter, they're peaceful. They exist in an idyllic, almost English countryside land called the Shire. And they're part of this alliance, technically. But in the beginning, they're barely even paid any attention to. In fact, most people don't even know hobbits exist for the most part. They're so few and so isolated. But they've been being protected in one way or another by this alliance, or by small groups within this alliance. And they play a critical role as individuals, but they are by no means a force as a large group on the international stage. However, by the end, after everything is done and they return to the Shire, they're able to prevent an attempted annexation of their homeland on their own without the help of their allies. Now, one of the lesser appreciated aspects of alliances are the fact that they empower smaller states and can often provide them insulation from those who wish them harm. In turn, hobbits who have been protected by greater powers even before the war provided the heroes necessary to win the war. If it weren't for the hobbits, Tolkien makes this very clear, if it weren't for hobbits in general, or hobbits as a people, Sauron would have won. And if you watch the movies, this is extremely clear, because the people who technically actually ended the war, because the Great Alliance goes to the gates of Mordor on what is essentially a suicide mission, and they know they're going to die. They're a distraction for two hobbits who have been making their way through this continent, attempting to destroy the One Ring, which will in turn end the war completely. So, what can be extrapolated here, and what we can take here into the real world, okay, is that the presence of strong countries in NATO and the protection that the NATO system gives the status quo world that we live in allows smaller countries to also provide assistance and insulates them. So when we invaded Afghanistan, when the NATO operations in Afghanistan, we had countries like Spain providing troops. We had them help, and now Spain is no hobbit, okay, but neither is it a great power anymore, right? Or certain countries can provide much needed resources or financial aid in times of war. So, in any case, small members matter in alliances and shouldn't be scoffed at, because they can often do great things, and they often do. I mean, Canada, though economically a good country has a low population, yet their actions in the wars in Afghanistan and to some extent in Iraq are heralded as being some of the bravest soldiers there. So what's this? So this is to say that with the rhetoric today and the complaining about NATO allies not paying their fair share, it is easy to forget just how successful this alliance has been and why it is still relevant not only as a machine of war, but as a coalition protecting a traditional order of the world. An order of the world that, for the most part, has worked out. An order of the world that, though it needs some tweaking, is preferable to the order of the world that would take its place. Now, of course, NATO isn't rallying together with an army of elves, dwarves, and men against a dark godlike lord and his monstrous army. But NATO is doing something, and I don't think we should be taking it for granted. If you enjoyed what you're listening to, please like and subscribe to the channel, and also give me some suggestions. I'll talk about almost anything with anyone. Have a great day, and I hope to talk to y'all soon.